All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Roguelike Celebration. What is a roguelike? So that's what we are going to try to find out. I am Santiago Zapata. I am the creator of Temple of the Roguelike, one of the first blogs that appeared that were focused on roguelikes. And I am also the developer of Ananias Roguelike. And in this talk, I would like to share with you some thoughts about this eternal question of what is a roguelike, and maybe we can find an answer for it. So, if you are a newcomer to this style of games, or if you have been playing for a long time, you will often find this kind of comments. You know what? That game is not a real roguelike. And then after that, there will be like a heated debate of what really is a roguelike. This happens very regularly. Like every week, you will see like a very long flame war regarding this topic. Um, but yeah, if it's the first time that you see that debate, don't worry. It's been going on for years, and no one has arrived to an answer for it. So if there's no answer, or if there is no answer, why bother like discussing that? So the actual real reason why I think it's important, besides confusing young people and being a grumpy old gamer, is discoverability, right? Some people really like this style of the original games, and you want to be able to find them. And it's a bit annoying when you go to Steam or you go to any app store and you go and try to find a roguelike, like expecting to find a turn-based game where you can take your time to make your decisions, and you are greeted by a lot of shooters and action games that don't look like a roguelike to you. So that may be one of the reasons why it makes sense to try to keep a definition for it. The second reason, keeping the original meaning, as we will see, may not make much sense. We will see in a bit. So, as I said, it's very hard to get a definitive roguelike definition. There is no governing authority that can say what is a roguelike. Unlike, for example, you can know what is HTTP 1.1 because the the IETF already describes what it is, and it's a governing authority. And well, when you have a definition, it's something definitive, it's something objective, and it's accepted widely. You do not have that for roguelikes because it's like a much more high-level concept, and well, then it's evolving, it's personal, and it's contested. Anyone that comes up with a roguelike definition will instantly get like a challenge to see why do you think it's that? Why is that true? So let's take a look at some of these efforts that have tried to define what is a roguelike. And we have literal interpretations, which are just guiding themselves by the name of roguelike. Historical interpretations, which is, I think, the most important part that we're going to see in this talk. And then those that have been tried to be established by an authority. As I say, there is no authority, but they have tried. So the literal interpretation, roguelikes are games that are like Rogue. Interestingly, this has been one of the most used ways of trying to define it. And I don't know if it makes much sense. I find it funny that when you look at the Wikipedia page of roguelike, there doesn't seem to have been like an effort to go into the history of the term and try to determine what it is. Rather, they have tried to analyze the word. All right, very simple, roguelike, like Rogue, the game from the 80s. The problem with this is that what features of Rogue are you taking and what features are you leaving? Because Rogue had some characteristics that are not, don't really apply to modern games. So do a roguelike have to be able to run on Unix mainframes? Okay, no, that's one of the features of Rogue, so maybe we could take it. And then if we go to like a higher level, so then a roguelike should have an identification game like Rogue. Maybe, maybe not. So where to draw the line, that's the issue when you try to use this literal interpretation of a roguelike. And in the end, all games are like Rogue, in one way or another, so it's not very helpful. So the next one is digging up the history of the term. And what comes next is a partial result of research I have been doing on the historical meaning of the word. I have not seen it in many other places, so I think it will be interesting at least to take a look. So it looks like the first broad usage of the word came from a reorganization effort by Andrew Solovey for Usenet. So Usenet was I am not like very technically savvy on this aspect, but what I understand about Usenet is that it was like a predecessor of the internet of sorts, right? So it was discussions groups that were distributed, and you just followed that group, and you had to connect to a server which was replicating the messages or everything going on there. This was before the internet became available. But sometime after internet was established, there was some ways to access the news group using, for example, Google Groups and some other technologies. But in any case, it seems that this was the first time that there was an effort to group these games that seem to be similar. And Andrew Solovey sent a request for discussion to create the rec.games.dungeon hierarchy. This happened in 1993. So he proposed that it made sense to to group these rogue type games, and the two characteristics that he said grouped these games were that they were character based, so everything was represented by characters, and that they were easy to port to various architectures. Well, this mainly happened because the discussions on the rec.games.rogue news group were overflowing with discussions from new games that were popping up. So he thought he saw that there was a genre being created there, of sorts. But then, as I said, initially it was rec.games.dungeon, and this was a request for discussion, and there was a lot of discussion. So some people expressed concerns about this because other games could sneak in that did not look very similar to what they said would be a roguelike. And again, there's like an emphasis on the style of the interface being like the defining characteristic of this kind of games. So he proposed, well, since Rogue is the granddaddy of all these games, I think it should be called Roguelike, or perhaps something else. Any ideas? And then a lot of more discussion happened. And surprisingly, something that is very surprising for me, most people thought it was crazy. Roguelike, that's the worst hierarchy name I have ever seen. Some other people say that it was a very poor name. And then, this is very interesting, some people did not see any relationship at all between Moria, Angband, and Rogue, for example. They say, okay, well, yeah, they look similar, but they play very differently. They are not the same genre of games. Why should we create a term for that? And yeah, nowadays we think, yeah, they have some common gameplay mechanics, but back then there were just similar games that looked similar, but did not had enough features in common to create a genre. And I think it's similar to nowadays when we see, for example, Call of Duty, and we see, I don't know, for example, Hearthstone. Yeah, they are similar. They are both played in computer screens or computer displays, but they are completely different. So why should we group them? And the thing is that back then, the character display was like one of the only ways that the games could be played. So people did not think of that being an unifying feature, just like a common thing that all games had. So really, it was not very well received. I mean, this request was like, why? Why? We do not need that. And yeah, for example, the third paragraph here, playing them was very different. So in the end, in any case, it was the least unpopular option. So that's how it came to be used in the group's hierarchy, being the least of all available evils. And then people started using it, and it became like established. But as I said, it was not a very good option. But that's what ended up in the end. Some people even say that we should call, well, if we create this genre, maybe it should be called Moria-like, since Rogue is now much more like a basic game, and Moria is more advanced. Some people say that since the unifying feature was the display, then maybe they should be called ASCII Dungeon games or TTY games. Well, there were a lot of suggestions. But in the end, Roguelike won the game. And that's how it became established. And, well, Usenet became like the cradle of the genre because that's where most of the discussion happened. That's where then the development group was created. And eventually, after the years, everybody forgot about that, forgot about how it was defined, and we just started trying to use the literal definition. This is another piece of information from Usenet. This one is from Aliza Panitz. And I think this is a bit closer than as we can get to an historical definition of roguelikes, even if today we feel a bit uncomfortable about it. But this one is a little bit more high level than the original one proposed on the RFD for the rec.games.roguelike hierarchy. So yeah, as you can see, it focuses on being single-user fantasy role-playing games set in a dungeon, run with a simple character graphic interface, and single character, sword, and sorcery, and they are all free games. So as we can see, in this definition, basically we are taking the games that were popular back then. All of them were like derivatives of Dungeons and Dragons or Sword or Sorcery. There was no notion of being sci-fi, a sci-fi roguelike, or another different kind of roguelike. And again, character graphic interface. That was like the main thing that people thought was important for being a roguelike. And then being free games. I was able to contact Aliza yesterday, and I hope she managed to come here. Not sure if she did, or he, not sure. And if she managed to come here, I would love to hear about that age of roguelikes that is almost forgotten on the 90s, and the community was very different. It was not very widespread, so if she can talk about that, maybe on that spot where people can propose talking, that would be great. And she also proposed what is not a roguelike game, right? To further define these boundaries. Commercial games were discarded from the definition, as well as multi-user games, puzzle games, and text adventure games. And as you can imagine, there was like an overlap because the text adventure games were considered, well, also use the console display, right? The character-based display. So if what you're looking for is on listed above, don't post to the roguelike groups. You will just annoy the ancient dragons. So already there was some people trying to keep the definition and keep like a very close definition. So as we can see, these historical interpretations don't make any mention of being turn-based, being permadeath or permafailure or permanent consequences, or even being procedural generated. It was not like a defining feature originally, historically, for the genre, and it is now, of sorts. So the emphasis was on some other things, which may not be very relevant today. It was a bit too open. It was contested in the beginning of the times. But by the time the request for discussion for the rec.games.roguelike development group was posted, which was around 5 years after that, that term was already established within them. So they learn to love it. Okay. So, but as we know, the usage of the word has evolved now, and it has evolved to focus on game design features rather than these presentation features or the distribution features. And that's why that historical definition, not sure how useful it will be today, right? So the third source of roguelike definition is by authority, but there's no authority that can establish what a roguelike is for now. So some examples here are the widely known Berlin interpretation. And we must say here that they did not really try to make like a very way to divide whether a game is a roguelike or not. They did it more like for purposes of studying these original rogue type games. And they took like the 5 more important roguelikes for that time, which was on 2008, and they took that as a canon and then extracted some features from these games and said a roguelike has these features. And there's a similar one, which I created for the Temple of the Roguelike, which has 13 features. So basically, they did take these 13 features and try to complement and define further based on that. But there's a problem with that. And it's that interpretation based on a list of features may block the innovation because you are not letting other kind of games come, so you end up with copies of the same game. So these are like the 3 kinds of roguelike definitions, and as I said, all of them are efforts that have not reached like an answer. But what is the result of not having like a clear interpretation? So these are some of the sad results of not having a clear interpretation of the genre. A bunch of amazingly fun procedural games. That's like one of the most important things that has happened. And I think most of people here knows all these modern games, which are mostly procedural, may not be turn-based, but are very fun to play. The second result is roguelikes being much less, I don't know how to pronounce this. Sorry, I'm not a native speaker. But now, much more people knows about roguelikes. And on the 90s and on the third decade of the 2000s, roguelikes were still like a developer thing. I mean, most of the players were also developers, and most of the players wanted to create their own roguelike. But that has changed, and roguelikes are now known by a lot more of people that are enjoying and playing. And now roguelikes also have higher production values because we need to reach more people. So we cannot like stick to unusable user interfaces or things that no one understands. All this new competition and all this new interest on the genre has elevated like the bar. So that has been good for the roguelikes because we are not stuck in the past. We are trying to make things better every time. So we are now in 2017, and devs are being much more careful. Since, as I say, this discussion has been happening for a long time now. And nowadays, if you check the stores, you will see that most games that are not turn-based are now labeled as roguelikes, right? Or as action roguelikes. The term roguelike, which used to be somewhat popular some years ago, no longer being used a lot. A new term, procedural dungeons of death, was created. And we also see a lot of games just saying that they have roguelike elements or are being procedural. So based on all these flame wars and all this discussion that has happened, they are more careful now to label their game as roguelike, right? Of all these, I think action roguelike, I think it's the one that I like the most because, as I said, the problem with having roguelite is that you are kind of diminishing that game. It's like a roguelike, but it's not that like hardcore. It's like more for casual gamers, and that's not really true. some of these games have very good production values, are a lot of depth. So why call them like roguelite? Like almost a roguelike, but not enough. No, it's not. I don't feel that it's good. Roguelike, then you have the same problem. You need to define what a roguelike is. So you are stuck on the same point. Procedural Dungeon of Death, it's good because it's very specific, but the problem is that same thing, because it only applies to a very specific kind of roguelikes where you're in a dungeon and it's procedural, and then maybe it's taking out the turn-based from the equation. But I think the roguelike elements apply to a broader set of games, so why stick to that particular one? And as I say, the two on the bottom, roguelike elements and procedural, are fine, are very correct, but as I said, action roguelike most of the times is enough for the issue of discoverability. When I am browsing Steam and I'm looking for roguelikes, if I see that it's labeled as an action roguelike, I know that it may not be what I like or what I'm looking for. So, does it make sense to conserve this original definition from the 80s? I mean, we have a lot of new games that are very fun to play, so why worry about this original definition? Well, the thing is that I think classic style roguelikes, which are turn-based, can be fun and can be modern and can be enjoyed by modern players. And I think it makes sense to have a definition or a set of parameters that allows you to continue looking for these kind of games in the future and finding them. So as I said, an interpretation is a very personal thing. And this is the one I have for a classic style roguelike, a roguelike that is turn-based, a roguelike that has permanent consequences and has procedural content. And basically what's happening here is that I have a list of 13 features, but I think these 3 are enough, like to have the most important parts of the spirit of these classic roguelikes and have it survive on the time. And this style of roguelike are still alive. We can see a list of some games here that have that original style of the roguelike games from the 80s, but had done a lot of efforts trying to be much more accessible for people and for modern gamers. You can see them in the modern stores like on Steam. So for the problem of fixing discoverability, I think 2 of the solutions that could be applied would be having curated catalogs so that people that like these kind of games has a list of reviews these kind of games and can provide like a way for people to find them more easily, and creating sub-communities around that topic. I think that may be 2 different solutions for this. So yeah, I think as a conclusion, as I said, you cannot define a roguelike. And I don't think we should try to define a roguelike. We should let the genre continue evolving. But it makes sense to also keep this definition of a classic style roguelike so that at the same time we can continue finding that kind of games. All right. I think that's what I wanted to share. And let's celebrate roguelikes of all sorts.
We have a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Santiago? No?
So how would you define a roguelike if you had to come up with a definition off the top of your head?
Well, as I said, that will be also a personal interpretation. And yeah, I would take out the turn-based from the equation. That's enough of a distinction because most of those kind of games, roguelike lights, what they have is the procedural part, right? And I think these 3 things, as I said, are like where most of the discussion goes on. When you remove turn-based, it's very different to play. You have an action roguelike or a roguelike light. when you remove permanent consequences, that may be also one of the things that define the roguelike likes, but most of the times it's tied to removing the turn-based for some reason, like to make it more accessible for players or something. So for example, you can save the game, or you have like a model where you have persistence of the items or the achievements that you have done in other gameplays. So I think that's how I would define a roguelike light.
Anyone else?
So you talked about how you like the action roguelike term because it kind of explains the turn-based versus real-time difference, and to you that's really important. For me, permanent consequences, permanent death versus some sort of meta progression system is the thing that I am most bothered by in the newer games. So I guess like, how do we find a way to like, have, because action roguelike doesn't describe that distinction, and it's also much harder to see. When I look at a game, I'm like, oh, this looks really cool, and I watch somebody play it for a little while, and then they unlock something that is going to work in their next run, and I'm just like, oh. So yeah, I don't know. Like, how do we find ways of classifying them more specifically? Because action roguelike isn't quite enough.
Yeah, as I said, yeah, I mean, you can much more easily see when a game is not turn-based, because you look at the screenshots or the videos and it's evident, right? But you cannot see the other part. And I think maybe what we can do is have the developers take a bit more of care of this and maybe announce about that kind of things. I mean, the same way that they are currently aware that they should say whether the roguelike is turn-based or action-based, maybe they can also describe the model that it has for handling this meta progression or all these new non-permanent consequences.
In terms of discoverability, I'm thinking about the term procedural content and feel like that's a real inside thing, right? That we all know that, oh, that means that the computer is running a procedure to create a world. But we mean, right, infinite replayability kind of. Do you think, I would just, as you were using the word procedural, and then I'm thinking, right, in America, a procedural means a police drama, right? and that if we like put that out there on Steam or something like that, are people going to know what that means?
Well, yeah, I think that term procedural inside the gamers, for the reasons that, I mean, for this explosion of new kind of roguelikes, is now a bit more known. So even if we may think that some years ago a gamer will not know what procedural was, but I think nowadays they do know it, and for some reason it's become like a good way of knowing what like that specific feature of the game. Because I mean, yeah, infinity replayability sounds like a much better term for that. I mean, facing the player, right? Not the way that it's done, but how the player perceives that thing. But I think a procedural, as I said, has been established and is useful for people to know that that game generates content and has not fixed content or levels.
When did that presumption of procedurality start jumping into people's assumption of the genre, since it wasn't there even in '95? I'm really curious.
I don't know.
Okay.
I am still researching that. I'm still doing that research. As I said, by 1998, there was already a group for developing roguelikes. And I think by then it was like the term had already evolved into considering that it was not about character-based display. They were on 1998. There was graphic games already, 3D games. So there should be something else that keeps these games together, and maybe that's when they found these gameplay things.
Last question.
It's less of a question, more of an observation that the differentiation was actually already occurring, but I don't think it was as explicit. So they were they made the explicit comparison to things like Zork, interactive fiction, in which there is this fixed world, and this consistent experience each time you go through it. And there are random elements, but at the same time, it is a fixed universe as opposed to something like Roar. Yeah, the rest of them are all dynamically generated, and possibly procedure generation may be a little bit too industry specific, but saying a generated world or universe or environment might be a more accurate representation to a larger audience.
Yeah, as we can see here, they had the idea, but they did not put it in words, right? So a roguelike, these are not roguelikes. But yeah, they did not have like at this point, it was not like a clear distinction of the terms. So